Hello, welcome to another Housing Sector podcast. Today I'm with Paul Kershaw. Paul, thank you very much indeed for joining me today on what is a topic which I'm sure is going to upset some, enlighten others, and scare most of us. Who are you? And give us a bit about yourself and your background. That would be great.
Well, I'm on the committee of SHAK, the Social Housing Action Campaign, which is a sort of network of housing association residents, tenants, and actually workers. But I'm also the chair of the Unite Housing Workers branch, the 1111 branch. And actually, that's where SHAK came from. It was initiated from that branch. And the reason for that is that we were seeing a real change in the nature of housing associations as employers from what not ideal, but certainly a bit more sort of socially aware and enlightened to being really hard nosed, quite brutal, and very much like a finance company, very profit orientated. And part of that is we noticed that also changed what tenants had to face. But as part of those changes, actually, I particularly remember a conversation about some job losses in a housing association. And actually, we'd mitigated the losses. I was talking with the reps, and they said, well, we've got redeployment, voluntary redundancy, we'll be all right. It's going to be terrible for the tenants. And they
Right.
said, in the past, there would have been tenant associations, tenant consultative structures, and we would have gone to them and warned them what was in the pipeline for them, but they don't exist now.
Yeah.
And that the logical thing that led to is, well, we need someone to talk to, and the tenants need their own voice. And that's really where SHAK came from.
I have found, and I was talking, I'm editing it now. So this is the 27th of March. The podcast that will go out on Monday is with Jenny, and then you're the week after. But I was
Right.
talking with Jenny, who set up Red Kite Housing. She'd been a tenant, and then she'd set up Red Kite Housing because of the bad blood there. And she said, we've been talking about the tenant's voice for the last 20, 30 years. But what we actually need to do is listen to the tenant. Do you think that's a fair
Absolutely.
portrait?
I'm afraid it absolutely is. And I don't want to say that things were ideal 30 years ago. They really weren't. But there has been a change. And I think, we've built this housing finance, and that might turn some people off. But actually, it's the key to why there's been that change. Because it's not just that from a cloud somewhere, some malevolent people have descended. There's a structural change in the nature of housing associations. And instead of being there run by people who in some way want to do something about the housing problems of the country, and where they go for grant funding to meet social need, and therefore they want to demonstrate they're meeting social need, to increasingly more and more uh, borrowing private finance in order to carry on and build. And that has changed. That's a structural change. It means that to be a successful housing association chief executive, the people you've got to please first are the investors. It means that even from the point of view of a regulator, and speak someone who was a housing regulator for a period, um, if you want assurance that a housing association isn't going to give you trouble, you really need to see expertise and concentration on the private finance, on pleasing the private finance. You've got complex financial derivatives. You need to see people who understand those financial derivatives. The board meetings end up that's what they're discussing.
Yeah.
There's absolutely not a focus on what are the tenants saying. And
And
there has been this that no doubt all housing associations will have some mechanisms where they can say, "Oh, we do listen to our customers." I mean, that's a false term in itself, by the way, isn't it? Because
yeah.
customers imply the right of exit. So the way you enforce it is you say, I'm going to take my homelessness elsewhere.
Yeah, that's it.
No, you don't have that meaningful right of exit.
This cultural change, because we're seeing more and more financial directors now being employed as CEOs of housing associations,
Exactly.
and that, of
Yeah.
course, one of my old finance directors, Martin. He won't mind me mentioning him. He was a lovely fellow to have a pint with after work, but he was as tough as they came during the office, And if that pot plant might be pleasing Sheila, if it's not bringing value and it's costing money, it goes, And he came
I
in
agree.
and
Yeah.
cut through.
Yeah.
And they're not the kind of people that we want. Well, it sounds like they are the sort of people that we need running our housing associations, but they're not the ones we need making human decisions that affect humans within their homes, is it?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that the way they treat their workforce is an interesting indicator because if you have, I mean, let's just cite a current ongoing issue, the ongoing strike at LIV Housing.
Right.
Uh, Now that's been going. There's been strike action off and on for 6 months. Uh, that they've reballoted. They're escalating. Now the chief executive there, when she arrived, they had a staff meeting, and she explained how one of her life models for her was Margaret Thatcher,
Oh,
which
right.
in Merseyside didn't go down terribly well. But it does appear to be absolutely the way she's operated. So there was a very good report uh, of the picket lines in the Daily Mirror, actually. And they went around talking to people, and there's always this attempt to set the workers against the tenants. But of course, the Daily Mirror journalists found that lots of the workers are actually live tenants,
Yeah.
and their pay increases. They've had real terms pay cuts over an extended period, which is the norm in the sector, and their pay cuts that their pay increases are much less than the rent increases that they're paying to live housing. And in microcosm, that will be reflected through the country and not just obviously for people that work for housing associations. Uh, and just to give an indication of the sort of management, it's not just that this is a strike, it's the really brutal question. Even the legalities of this are questionable. That they decided to, just before Christmas, to offer a pay increase to staff, but they had to sign a statement that they were not in a union in order to get the pay increase.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
quite astounding. So, far from, so this is a major organization in a community in Knowlesy with real social problems, and it's not an organisation that reflects the needs or the wishes of that community. It's an organisation that reflects the needs and wishes of the investors, of business, of profit.
Let,
So,
let's come on to these investors, because if we
mm,
if we believe the horror stories, so we've got housing associations who are either patting themselves on the back for doing so great, or they're pleading poverty. When they're pleading poverty and we're putting up service charges, and everything has to go up because we're not making money, we're losing money. And yesterday on Radio 4, that was the sort of thing that they'd push back on. We're losing money on service charges, which is why it's got to go up. Why are people so keen to invest in a sector that is clearly failing and not making money?
you've just gone to the core of the issue there. That's exactly it. And in fact, if you read their annual reports, and many of them for the stock markets issue more frequent reports, they say how well they're doing, which is curious, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the the investors, as you say, see this as a very good bet, and they see that. Well, there was a last year there was an awful interview, to be honest, in Inside Housing with the BlackRock people, And they said, well, we're investing in Britain because we see there's this shortage of social housing and there's real social need. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think it's perfectly clear they're investing because they get a return. It's about de-risking. The return may not be a very high percentage, but they calculate this is a pretty safe investment in a world where that's unusual. And they're looking for opportunities like this around the world. There's been a huge, particularly in those sort of institutional investors, there's been a huge increase since the global financial crash in particular. I think the institutional investors in social housing, I saw a figure the other day that estimates that that's gone up by 450%. So they've become a major driver. Why are they going into it? It's because they see a return for their investors, and they wouldn't be. They'd pull out very quickly if they didn't think that was there. And when you think of the Labour manifesto, it talked about um, de-risking investment and the need to attract investment to make it an attractive possibility. And then you think of we're talking in March 2025. There's just been this statement from Reeves, from the Chancellor, and just leading up to that, there was an announcement of a step change of new investment in uh, in social housing or affordable housing. That's another question, isn't it? The difference between those we could come back to. And actually, the Financial Times had a quote from the chief executive of Clarion, Claire Miller, and she basically it's saying this is actually a cut. So far from all the trumpeting that this is a step change, it is an extra lump of money, but it's less than the previous lumps of money. So as you go on, that
Yeah.
actually is a cut at the moment. But what they said is, well, what we need, therefore, is a long-term rent settlement. And what they mean by that is over inflation rent increases going out into the indefinite future, going out for many years. And that way they say, well, we will then be an attractive investment. And then we can build new homes and so on. So really what they're asking for is to build new homes on the backs of existing tenants who may not, they're not all poor, but they're definitely not the rich. It's
No.
definitely a policy of redistribution, taking from ordinary people, the poor, not a redistribution, a progressive redistribution. And that is the voice of housing associations. That's what they campaign for. That's why tenants need their own voice, with SHAK and
Yeah.
campaigns.
So when I say, look, the system's broken, it's not working, I'm paying service charge, but you're not fixing or you're not maintaining communal areas, it's not working. I've got it wrong, haven't I? It's working, but the output is to generate
Yes,
money for these investors,
that's exactly right. I think, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
which is
and
shocking.
it is shocking, and we know there's been increasing attention to disrepair in the sector,
Mm.
and I think there has been a bit of a shift. It's clear in spending on investment on repairs, trying to catch up, but it is catching up. I mean, it is after years of underinvestment in housing management, and actually, not all the information is in the published accounts. But I think if you look at the published accounts, they make pretty good profit margins when they break down and separate the social housing operation. So if housing associations have got problems, it's not in that basic issue of collecting rent, doing the repairs. They're doing very well out of that. Thank you very much.
Well, that's what I'd like to think. And if I was an investor, I would want the housing association that I've invested in to maintain the homes within their portfolio so my
Mm.
investment maintains its value. surely that should be quite a positive goal for all of us. Because I'm not necessarily saying I'm not against paying service charge as long as it's reasonable and I'm receiving the benefits. I'm not opposed to external financial investors coming in and helping to support a sector. I'm all for it as long as my home is warm, safe, dry, and affordable.
Two things there that come to mind. One is the sort of market discipline, the fact that if you're a housing association tenant, you don't really have the right of exit in a meaningful way.
No.
You can't. It's not like I'm not going to shop in Marks and Spencers. I am going to shop in um, Next or something like that.
Mm.
Uh, and therefore, that's the importance of having some kind of democratic accountability, I would say. But I think there's always going to be a problem if you're competing on global financial markets to get this money in, to get to do the investment. And actually, many years ago, the National Audit Office did an assessment of whether moving to private finance, whether that was economical or not. And because in the past, social housing had been built through grant funding. And to the extent there is borrowing behind that, that's at much lower interest rates. And the conclusion was curious because they said actually they concluded it was a lot more expensive, this move, and the move's gone much further
Right.
since then. But they concluded it was the right thing to do. And their conclusion was basically ideology. This was back in the period of dominant Thatcherite ideology, but those ideas are still the accepted norm in policy circles. So to say that we should have um, fully funded public housing nowadays is it's sort of rude to suggest that in policy circles, but that has real world consequences. That does change the nature of these organisations. So I think it's important to put that back on the agenda, particularly now in times of drastic financial uncertainty, the cost of living crisis, and so on. I think
Yeah.
we do need to say, well, there's very good reports talk about housing as a human right. And
Mm.
when you think about it, it is completely fundamental
Yeah.
to civilized existence, to participating in society. Unfortunately, those arguments alone don't get you far. You need social forces to enforce what we're calling a right. But
Yeah.
that's what's at stake, really.
Housing, health, education, food, water,
Yes,
and you can thrive as a
exactly.
human being. Yeah.
Yeah,
Without having to worry about where you're sleeping tonight or where your next meals come. All right,
exactly.
let's have a look now. So all this, they're all pleading poverty. We need more money. This is why service charges. We're all pleading poverty, and we see when and it was last week that Places for People announced that they were taking over non-compliant South Yorkshire homing. I'll put links in the description in case I've got that wrong. But they were merging with those, so it's a smaller failing housing association that's being swept up into Places for People. What happens? What's going to happen if one of these housing associations cannot afford and goes under?
I mean, that's an interesting question, actually. So there was also the regulator gave some sort of assurance quite recently that they do still have big associations lined up who are willing to take over small associations. By the way, that's a bit of a pointer that you know when they plead poverty,
Mm.
it's not completely clear, and that always has been the way of sorting out crises in the past. But another question that has always been raised for a long time is that's okay if you've got a relatively small organization and you're trying to find a, a rescue, and you find one of the really big organizations that have got really deep pockets and can take it over. What would happen if one of the really big housing associations had problems?
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone's really got a good answer for that.
No.
uh, and we're saying, I think I'm saying that actually housing associations are a profitable business. Yeah. And they will obviously, as we've said, they'll say, "Oh no, but we plough all our surplus back." But of course, they are making profits for the investors.
Yeah.
As the investors wouldn't be investing, so they are driven by those by that logic. But then again, before the financial crash, the banks were doing very well, but they did crash.
Yeah.
And we are talking about part of that sector now with the private investment. So it's not unimaginable that one of the big housing associations could hit serious problems. Actually, at the time of the last financial crash, some of them were in real trouble. I don't think it's a secret that some of them were in effect insolvent or close to insolvency. And actually, when you think about it, that would have had a massive effect in that financial crash because the banks were worried about subprime loans and confidence. But housing associations were supposed to be the absolutely safe
Yeah.
prime
Yeah.
loan. And it had cataclysmic effects, actually, if one of them had gone under. And it wasn't so far from that. It wasn't an unimaginable situation. So it's sobering, actually, to consider to think of those considerations.
Do you think, and I'll get called out for being some sort of conspiracy theorist now, do you think that we are maintaining this narrative of, it's a struggle, but we're successful, we're building new homes, we've been upgraded to G1, do you think this sort of narrative and the events, the corporate events, the China Institute of Housing, the National Housing Federation, all the sort of good news that they post, and the fact that we get so little engagement from the mainstream media and the MPs that it's a shrine. We're keeping it closely hidden. This is a secret that actually we're all close to collapse, and when it happens, it's going to be a disaster.
Well, it's probably not a I think they believe their own propaganda to a large extent, which is quite worrying.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think a lot of tenants, when they get active and they get involved, they are absolutely shocked by how much their chief executives paid. You
Yeah.
think, well, I'm paying that. My rent, that's where my rent's going. And that's, I think, absolutely legitimate. But in a way, they are small time players in this. If you look at BlackRock, Blackstone, I mean, you're talking their chief executives talk about literally up to 1 billion a year, not a million,
Mhm.
1 billion a year. That's income, not wealth. That's the sort of scale. And those organizations, it's not really a conspiracy because this is completely open. It's not secret in that sense. It's not well reported in the corporate media. That's true. That they have influence on politicians around the world. And you can see similar policies to this Labour government's policies around the world. And you can see similar problems, actually. I mean, SHAK had a meeting on Zoom with similar activists, campaigners in Spain. It's a very different institutional structure. But when you got behind it, the problems of disrepair, rents going up, sounded very, very similar, actually.
Yeah.
And the investors were the same, not similar. And when you look at it from that point of view, it's not. I don't know if conspiracy is the right word, but it's definitely it's part of the what started to be known as Thatcherism, I suppose, the dominance of unfettered market policies, pro profit policies, really, uh, that's playing out. And the other thought I have there, just about you know what layers, what different people do, is when I was for a period, I worked for the regulator back when there was a Labour government, the last Labour government, and there was talk about we don't approve of the fact that housing association bosses are being paid more than the prime minister, even back then. And so but we didn't have any power as a regulator to insist on that. So we were sent out. It wasn't the easiest of jobs to talk to housing association chief executives about the fact that it wasn't very good that they were paid more than the prime minister. And I can tell you, I got a lot of responses that weren't very polite.
I can imagine. Yeah.
But the logic of what they said was twofold. Well, they gave two typical examples. One was, look, I deal with the banks all the time. Even quite junior people in the banks are paid several times what I get paid.
Hmm.
So go away.
Right. So that makes it all
You know?
right.
Yeah. Or there was actually one of them was just in the process. I think it fell through in the end that they were going to take over a speculative builder, a private builder, quite a small one. And the logic was they had good knowledge of land markets and land banking, and therefore they would help with development. And he said that um, the boss of that organisation, which he claimed was definitely was smaller than the association and uh, was simpler to run, they would retain him in the subsidiary because they would want to retain, at least for a few years, his knowledge. And he was paid, I think it was 4 or 5 times what this chief executive was. And he said, well, you can't touch me for doing that. I will still be on my pay. You'll be telling me I'm underpaid. I don't
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah. It seems
So
when
that
you, as a resident, you know, he's not getting things fixed. You think, well, hang on a minute, my CEO is clearly failing, and yet she's taken a 6% pay increase this year, you know, which beggars belief. But if the paymasters are really her investors and she's succeeding, then she's warranted it, and this is why she can no longer be removed. She sits on the board of the National Housing Federation, and it's not about good housing anymore. It's about global economics.
absolutely. I mean, I gave you and that's what leads to success. So I gave you the example of this self-declared Thatcherite boss of LIV Housing, where there's this ongoing strike, which is not good for services and repairs and so on.
Mm.
And we know that Notting Hill Housing Group has had its problems, very public problems,
Yeah.
uh, and they've publicly trumpeted that they've appointed her to their board because apparently she's going to tell them how to solve their problems and revamp their organisation. Well, if I was a worker or a tenant at Notting Hill Housing Group, I think I'd take that as a bit of a warning.
Yeah. Or the fact that her workforce are out on strike might not be the best. It's a very small pond, isn't it? And we do see the same sort of people bounce around within the sector, and you know that
Right.
happens in every sector because they've got that knowledge. But you think we need some fresh blood in there, or do we need a course correction, or are we just doomed to keep going the way we're going?
Well, we need fundamental change, and that will require very different set of people
Mm.
and different skills. I mean, you touched on it. We need people who understand people and housing management, actually, which is not really a big consideration. Uh, that will require, I think, a return. Well, right now it does require some sort of democratic check. I think that's something to really push for because it's not a proper market.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's the immediate thing. But really, it needs a return to publicly funded housing focused on meeting social need. And that would change the priorities. And that doesn't mean copying exactly how things were done in the past, because I think there could be more, vastly more democratic accountability than there was in the past.
Yeah.
But at least that's the focus that we need, really.
Well, Paul, it's a very sobering conversation, isn't it, to have? But yeah, look, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to me today. And I think it's a conversation I'd like to come back to at some point, if that's okay. Because
Yeah,
the idea we initially got together to have a conversation yesterday to talk about sort of who was profiting from the not-for-profit, and we've barely touched the surface of it, have we?
yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. It's a good opener. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Paul. I really appreciate it. Stay strong and I'll be in touch and we'll have another go.
Okay, that's great. Good to see you then. Bye then.